Then we had all the intervention by the Fed, the TARF and TALP and BARF programs, whatever, all the capital put into the banks. That made people feel okay. And then we realized, but our homes were still overvalued, and that we went through a long number of years where our home prices dropped by 40%. That was that next part of the W until we came out of that. It took basically 3 or 4 years to come out of that, eat up the inventory, and have all those empty homes fill back up. So I think we're halfway through a W right now, that we saw the shock of the 10 interest rate increases. We saw the Silicon Valley Bank failure and the rattling of the banking stuff. And then we've had a decent summer. We've not had more bank failures. We've had things kind of settle down. And so we had energy prices come down. We used the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So consumer confidence came back up. Well, now if we find the Fed continues on the rate hikes where we're already at, and that we continue to see household debt rise, our debt, another debt ceiling, we see all those things compound here starting in October. I think that's when we could see that other dip and reform the W in the consumer confidence. So look at those pieces, and then in the University of Michigan data, they have an important piece there called the Index of Consumer Expectations. It's what the consumer expects. So even though they tell you they're feeling okay right now, above 75, 70, 75, what they're telling you their expectations are to go back below 70. And so that's really the consumer looking forward. So that's why I say it's so important to look at patterns in all of our data today, economics or otherwise. All right. So putting all that in perspective, I found a quote. It's probably going to be my quote of the year. I even resurrect at the end of the year my forensic analysis of 2023. And so at the top is kind of the academic PhD phraseology of this quote. Cognitive bias is a pernicious aspect of human thought, blah, 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 blah. But at the bottom is the layman's translation. Accepting that many correlations that have traditionally provided insight may no longer be functional is essential to navigating today's markets. In other words, the data we looked at in the past to predict a recession, to predict disruption, to predict what's going to happen in commercial real estate, those metrics, like unemployment, may not be predicted this time. We may not see a 5% unemployment situation. We may not see GDP go negative, but in all other aspects, we feel like we're in a recession. Our industry in particular, being choked off by capital, may definitely feel like it's in a recession. So what I challenge everybody today to do is quit looking at all this traditional government data and think outside the box of private industry data. So what are a couple of examples I'll give you? So any that are in the industrial side, I look at a new metric that Maersk has, and they've managed for a long time, called their destocking index. So Maersk has about 17% of the world's shipping business. They handle everything from Walmart and Nike and Unilever. And so they really know what's happening with containerized goods and coming into the US. And what they're seeing is the destocking that we're told is supposedly occurring because of strong consumer spending. It's not happening. The warehouses are staying full. They're not getting a call from the retailers to say, hey, come stock the furniture, come restock the Walmart store, come restock the shoes. They're saying that where they thought this year might have a 2.5% slowing in shipping, mainly loaded in the first half of the year, they're seeing an overall decline of about 4%. So if the people that move the goods around the world, like Maersk, are not seeing the warehouses needing to restock because the retailers are not calling them, or the e-commerce folks aren't calling them to say we need more inventory, that tells us there's something not right in this consumer spending and these retail sales figures. My theory is we're not buying more stuff. We're just paying more for the same stuff. So I like this one a lot. It tells me a lot what's going on industrial, tells a lot what's going on retail and consumer spending. The next one, we have a new indicator that we didn't have a year ago from pods. So we love every 10 years when we get the new census data, and it's great for about a year or two. Then I wait for the January of every year when we get the U-Haul moving report that tells us where everybody moved, where people are going, where workforce is going, where site selection is going. But that data gets stale by about now, September. So now we have a new indices that comes out every month from pods, the shipping containers that we all use to move our stuff. And millennials in particular use this, and empty nesters that are trying to clear out the house if they're going to move and don't want the kids to come back, and they leave the pod in the yard for them to pick up and, Mary, come get your pod, John, come get your pod. Or the millennials are moving and they're storing their stuff until, they find housing. And what pods is telling us is where people are moving real time. And so what they're telling us is there is this sustained movement of inland to the Midwest and to the South. And in fact, in their latest data, 6 of the 12 markets where the most pods were moved to were all in Florida. And it's primarily a southeast story, Texas, and whatnot. So when you're wondering where maybe some of your neighbors have gone and what happened to the pods that were in their driveway, they probably came out of California into a southern direction. So this is one I like. It's really good supplementing demographic data, market analysis, site selection activity. So these are 2 examples I'm using that are good, fresh primary data to be thinking about. All right. Now I want to pivot to interest rates, banks, and the Federal Open Market Committee. So I put this graphic together, this slide with these 3 visuals at the bottom to really describe when the Fed went on pause in June. They skipped and they said, but we're not really going to stay there. We're going to go back to raising rates. And I said, man, this is just like jump rope as a kid. You know, jump, skip, do whatever we need to do. So on the left, the graphic with the FOMC members with a box over their head, running around on a field, trying to find the inflation soccer ball. This was when they were saying there was no inflation. Then they said, well, maybe it's transitory. Well, maybe it's going to be transitory longer. And then eventually they got kicked off the field when they said, forget we ever said anything about inflation and transitory. And then they said, we're going to go over here on the right and we're just going to start hiking rates. So go back to last year. So they went January, they knew they had an inflation problem and they failed to raise rates. February, they take off every year because they were hoping the groundhog would tell them whether they found his inflation shadow. So he found the inflation shadow. March, they came back and said, okay, we'll do a quarter point. We'll do a token little amount. Then the Fed takes April off every year for spring break. Then they came back after April into May and they said, wow, we can't do quarter points. We got to get serious. We're going to show the market we're serious. We're going to do a 50 basis point increase. That didn't phase the market. So what did they do with the next rate hikes? They did 75 basis point rate hikes. So then we get to this point here this year where they started saying, well, maybe we're going to give to the political pressure. Maybe we need to pause a little bit. So we'll skip a month. We'll skip June. But then we come back in July and then we have August off. So what are they going to do now? The chart in the middle there with the different lines, the red, blue, orange, and whatnot, that is the graphic of all the Fed rate increasing cycles going back, to the 1970s, 1960s. And this series of 11 rate increases is the fastest, steepest that we've had in the Federal Reserve's history since World War II. So if it feels bad, it is bad. And if we wonder why we have a lot to really be anxious about for our industry, for our banks, is that the Fed did not stop and ask the simple question once during all these hikes: how are the banks and how are the economy and our businesses holding up? So here's the answer. So March 8th, I was in the Dallas Fed briefing the bank regulators, and I had a little question for them. I said, how healthy do you think the bank's balance sheets are and the balance between their assets and liabilities when you reprice commercial real estate under these higher interest rates? And they all looked at me like I was from Mars. The next day, Silicon Valley Bank failed. And it failed because the composition of assets that were largely fixed rate instruments, treasuries, mortgages, commercial real estate, all of those were upside down. And the liabilities, which were their deposits, these assets didn't make enough revenue, didn't pay enough income to basically pay for those. And so that's why we had Silicon Valley Bank failure, we had First Republic, we had Signature Bank, and now we're seeing a lot more play out. So the Fed did a forensic report. I give them kudos for this. And they published this at the end of April 28th. And I want you to read this. This is right their own words. So when I say this is the worst Fed ever, it's their own words that indict them. So look in the middle. Supervisors, the 2 red arrows. Supervisors did not fully appreciate the extent of the vulnerabilities as Silicon Valley Bank grew in size and complexity. When supervisors did identify those vulnerabilities, they did not take sufficient steps to ensure that Silicon Valley fixed those problems quickly enough. And over on the left, it says regulatory standards for Silicon Valley Bank were too low. The supervisors of Silicon Valley Bank did not work with sufficient force and urgency. And so at the bottom there in the middle, it promoted a less assertive supervisory approach. But if that doesn't get your goat, look on the far right. Their conclusions were, we need to evaluate how we supervise and regulate a bank's management of interest rate risk. Are you kidding me? I was in the Fed 2005 to 10. The reason we did stress tests and developed all that stuff was to address just this type of question. It's banking 101. Go further down. They said, in addition, we are also going to evaluate how we supervise and regulate liquidity risk. Again, are you kidding me? How many of you running your business have no clue on your liquidity risk, whether you're going to be able to make payrolls, what the revenues are coming in? And this is what the Federal Reserve on the policy side, Jay Powell and the FOMC voting members, were thinking and saying compared to the bank supervisors, the fiscal side, the San Francisco Fed. They didn't ask the San Francisco Fed, are y'all doing your job? Are y'all checking out the assets and liabilities? And this permeates not just the San Francisco Fed, but all 12 Federal Reserve districts. And to make you even kind of more frustrated about it, when I went through this 2008 to 2010 at the Fed, or 2005 to 2010 at the Fed, in 2009, what happened to Silicon Valley Bank almost happened to legacy SunTrust Bank, now Truist Bank, the sixth largest bank. They were too cozy. The Atlanta Fed was too cozy with SunTrust Bank. They didn't enforce the rules. They didn't take action. And so when the whole subprime blew up, SunTrust Bank had one thing that saved their bacon that Silicon Valley Bank didn't have. They owned this little thing called the Coca-Cola stock. And they had to liquidate that. And when the Fed sent the New York Fed down to audit the Atlanta Fed, they found that the bank supervision was so bad and so lacking, they took it away for 1 year. They transferred it to the Richmond Fed. That same action is likely to happen from the San Francisco Fed in the transference of bank supervision maybe to the Dallas Fed until they clean up their act. But to think that we went through all this in 2008, 9, and 10, and we're back in this same bucket again is what really frustrates me from having been on the inside, living through all of this nightmare. So I share that with you. That's their own words. All right. So then after April 28th, we get the bank stress test at the end of June. And what did the Fed tell us about the bank stress test? It's all cool, man. Everybody passed. Let's go party. Let's go. Let's get ready for Mardi Gras this fall. And so, but then they came back with two comments. And the two comments were, but a couple of the banks really didn't pass. They need to raise capital. And those two banks were little banks called Capital One and, oh my God, Truist Bank again. And what these stress tests are designed to do is they're designed to throw an economic scenario at the banks and say, right now, today, you hold about 10% capital. And we want to see if you can weather a really bad recession and still hold 4.5% capital. That's what they are. That's what they test. But guess what they didn't do? They didn't test for a NIM going negative, net interest margin. They didn't test for bank deposit flight. They didn't test for uninsured deposits, which is what really hit Silicon Valley Bank. All these things that are present. Remember those things that we didn't look at in the past that we're going to need to look at today to be predictive? They didn't look at any of those items. So what resulted was the rating agencies coming in. So you wonder where Moody's came in and where does Moody's think that they're all knowing to downgrade the banks. And now Fitch is piling on and the other rating agencies. And what they did is they read that April 28th report. They looked at the forensics and they looked at what's happening in the bank's net interest model. And they said, man, there are pressures and capital weakness and growing profitability issues here. If a bank has to pay more for deposits than it can lend out at, that's a bad business model. It'd be like a retailer today saying, I'm going to sell all of my inventory for less than I can replenish it for and see what happens when I need to go replenish it. They'll be out of business. They'll be bankrupt. And that's the model that we have that Moody's and the rating agencies are saying right now is how do our banks that can't make a profit, the loans they have do not pay a sufficient interest rate to cover what they're having to pay for deposits. So we're seeing deposits leave the banks. They're massively leaving, they're going to money markets. So all that capital we thought was built up in the banks to lend and keep them healthy, it's all leaving. It's not sticky. It's very spongible. And so here's an example in your own backyard where the credit unions are squared off now against the community banks because you have credit unions leading the nation in the most amount of interest they're willing to pay for deposits. And you've got some that are paying over 7%. How in the world do you run a bank? How do you lend? How do you make a mortgage? How do you make a construction loan? How do you make an auto loan when you've got to pay 7% on the deposits, plus you got to make a spread on it? You're looking at 9 or 10% interest rates. And that's the problem that's facing. And what that means is that's less capital for the banks to lend to us and every other industry. And so it's not that we broke real estate. We didn't over leverage. We didn't overbuild. We have a really screwed up capital model. And the Fed doesn't understand the consequences of what they've done on these interest rate hikes and what it's doing to a complete capital lockup. So that's what we're going to have to wrestle through. That's what we're going to have to think through. Where are we going to find the alternative capital? Is it going to be private equity? Is it going to be institutional money? Is it going to be credit unions? Is it going to be some other capital source that we haven't really thought through yet? But we're going to have to see something change here. That's the big challenge. So I want to pivot from that to something that's even more, or is even lacking more liquidity, the water crisis. So you guys are well dialed into this. So the Colorado River Basin region, 7 states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Idaho, all of these that feed into the Colorado River Basin have been extracting more water for decades than it can replenish. So even though we had a great winter with lots of snowpack and rain and Hurricane Hillary, that by the way I flew out into a few weeks ago, that's not enough. We need years of that to fill up the reservoirs, Meade and Powell, Lake Powell and Meade, and still we'd probably drain it because we have more water extraction than we're putting back into that water system. So we've faced issues over the last year and a half, where we had extreme options that were being proposed. One was everybody got to cut their water usage by 30%, except California. Do y'all wonder why California gets exempted? Because you have the senior water rights in the Colorado River. The courts can't tell you what to do. And so you use a lot of it. About 40% of the water that comes out of the Colorado River goes for agriculture in California. So that's why you're exempted. So the compromise they came to over the summer that took effect last month is the following. You only have to reduce your water consumption by 13%. That sounds manageable compared to 30%, right? But here's the new twist on it. No longer do you get to buy water out of the Colorado River Basin for $20 an acre foot, what it's been for over a half century. You're now going to pay over $520 an acre foot for the water. And what that means, as you read at the bottom of that article, is that almost all agricultural uses are no longer highest and best use or feasible. So you think about your economy in the Central Valley and how much of that is tied to agriculture in Sacramento and Central Valley, and what it means when you have to pay $520 an acre foot for agricultural residential. Now there's exemption for industrial and commercial, so don't stress, but for ag and residential, this is a very serious number. And so that's going to be something we're going to be wrestling with to figure out. In Phoenix earlier this year, they told the Howard Hughes Corporation you couldn't start pull water permits on a land deal that they put together in the West Valley for 100,000 homes. And the Arizona Department of Water Resources did a Seinfeld episode, no water for you. Imagine that. So they're very serious about this. So the water issue isn't just in the West. And I remind people, this is in the Great Plains. So in the Great Plains, we have this thing called the Ogallala Aquifer. So it's the equivalent of a Great Lakes underground that provides almost all the water for agriculture and life in basically the Great Plains, from the Dakotas down to Nebraska, Iowa, into Colorado, Kansas, all of those areas. It took 6,000 years to create, with all the water permeating down through the soils, and is within 100 feet of being empty. And so we're looking at a real serious consequence here in the next 1 to 2 years, where pumping water out of the Ogallala Aquifer becomes a cease and desist. And that's 30% of all the groundwater used for irrigation in the US, and 80% for all of the people living across the Great Plains. What happens when that goes dry, where you don't have that water usage? So when you guys think it's bad, just tell them to go talk about the Ogallala Aquifer. And so what this means is the United States is probably on the verge of the next 3 to 5 years, to pivoting to being a net importer of agriculture and food. No longer are we going to be the breadbasket exporting wheat and corn and all of this alfalfa to feed exotic horses in Saudi Arabia from California. And so what does that mean? What does that mean in supply chain? What does it mean in cost? What does it mean in national security? These are all issues that we're really going to have to seriously start thinking through. So it's not just a West issue. And so I wanted you to feel a little bit better about that it's broader than that in the country. All right. So that's the liquid water issue. What is the number one headwind that I think we face other than the Fed and its interest rate hikes? And that is household debt. So every month, the New York Fed produces a household debt report. And every month this year, it's broke a new record. So we're now over $17 trillion in household debt. So that's about twice the Fed's balance sheet. It's about half of our annual GDP. And we now have credit card debt over $1 trillion. And so our debt situation in this country, whether it's at a federal level, a state level, a household level, it's really at unsustainable levels. And then when you pile onto that higher interest rates, how do we sustain that level of debt and continually take down more fiscal debt at higher and higher interest rates? And that's really a question. So on this chart here, I pulled out and I put in green the auto loans and yellow the credit loans. We will probably see sometime next year that credit card debt will surpass student loan debt. So those are some pretty sobering type numbers. All right. So here's the other piece, which is the rise in credit card delinquencies. This is that forward-looking indicator. On the other hand, so yes, we still have credit capacity, and we have lines of credit, and we can still put things on our credit card, and we can still spend, but we're becoming more and more delinquent in our credit card debts. And it's particularly profound in the 20 to 39 age generation. That's the age that forms households, it spends a lot of money, it has to buy a car, they have to buy furnishings. This is the consumption category. And they are now seeing in the blue line there a huge spike in the amount of credit card delinquencies to the degree that it's approaching 20% of all credit card debt for the 20 to 39-year-old is delinquent. So how do they continue to grow? And you look at, for those of us that are in our 60s or older, we're managing our credit fine. We have assets. We paid off the house. We can manage that. But at that young group that we need to move into apartments, to form households, to retail spend, that's where this strain is really the most significant. All right. So put all that in perspective and ask you, where is the salary, what it takes for a single person to live the lowest in the country, and where is it the highest? So good news here. You guys didn't make the top list. Washington didn't even make the top 5. It was Hawaii, it was Massachusetts, I think that's an eastern state, New York, another eastern state, Alaska. And so we know the anomalies in Hawaii and Alaska, whether it's, energy or, everything has to be imported, why those are so high. And look at what it takes a single person. So if you're a dual working household, you're looking at $200,000+ a year to just survive, to have a living wage. And so when you look at the states that are on the right, where it's lowest and under 50,000, this also helps explain why people are moving, why all those pods are coming south. Arkansas, Georgia, and then to the Midwest. The Midwest is even a better story on basically trying to find the affordability. So it's the Midwest and it's the southern region that have the affordability. All of the things to live are a lot less. And so you don't have to make as much wage, which means companies don't have to pay you as much. So when they do site selection, this is why they're picking all of these places, basically, from the Great Lakes south or between Texas and Florida. So this is kind of revealing on what it takes and what's broken, and how do you translate that down to different submarkets and MSAs in California. The other one is the gap between the cost to own versus rent. And so again, this is, you guys know the story. So look at the top there, San Francisco and San Jose, the difference in the monthly cost to rent or pay a mortgage on a house versus to rent. And you're looking at $7,500 to $8,000 a month difference. That's staggering. You've got to figure out the affordability issue. But look at it. It's not all you guys. Look at Salt Lake City. I mean, you're over $2,000 a month. Salt Lake City, almost 3/4 of the workforce that supports the ski industry, the hospitality industry, the first responders, the hospitals, they cannot afford to rent or own in the Salt Lake Valley region. The same thing is happening if you go into Montana. So I was up there for in Bozeman earlier this year for the new CCIM chapter up there. And the migration of people leaving the West Coast into there is causing the same lack of affordability issues. So we really got to look at where is it like within $500 to $1,000. You got to go down in North Carolina, into Florida, into Atlanta, Chicago, Indianapolis. Those are the places where that difference is not so extreme. So if you don't want to rent and you want to own a home and you have a family, this is where you're going and why you're going. So it's kind of like peeling that onion back, and don't just look at the macro ratio about, why people are moving and why so many pods, but understand the why. And the why is all about affordability. And this was happening before COVID. This is a great graphic, another one by Visual Capitalist, where they graph, what's happening between the cost of rent versus, versus own here. Where'd my mouse go? There we go. Locked up on me here. And so you can see, when you're at $1,800 nationwide to rent, 1845 versus $2,700, that doesn't seem that bad a differential when you look at it at a national level, but when you start translating it by market or by state, it's a big deal. All right, so now we're going to talk about the commercial real estate losses, because this is what a lot of us are going to be involved with. Do we help resolve this? Are we retained as experts to help deal with these problems and the capital sources that are lining up to take advantage of it? So this is an article I read over the summer. I really recommend it. It's one of the most neutral balance between, is commercial real estate dead or long-lived CRE? And what it did there on the right is it went through all the prior periods that we've had real estate really get bumped up quite a bit. So you look at the 1980s, the S&L crisis, the early 90s, you look at the dot-com crash around 2000, Y2K, and the recession there, you look at the 2007 to 12, great housing and financial crisis, and now you look at COVID. And what's neat about this article is they bring out the things that came to surface, that came to light, that got real estate back to long-lived commercial real estate that were never thought of before. Think back, when you go back to, the 2008 and 2009 and the wall of maturities and all the CMBS that was going to blow up in 2010 and 11. And we did know that the Fed was going to lower rates and that we were going to allow all the banks and the securitized entities to do interest-only facilities and kick everything down the road. Nobody saw that going into 2008 and 9, that became a solution. So what I would say to everyone today is the things that are going to develop that are going to help us get through what we're facing, we don't know yet. We haven't seen them. We haven't seen tax code changes. We haven't seen a presidential and national election that maybe fires this Fed, brings in a new Fed that applies different monetary policy, which works the balance sheet more than it does higher interest rates. So this is a great piece to get you thinking about what are the kinds of things that could surface or that we could try that make us get through these prior periods of time. So one of the things that I use to help me think about this is the TREP data. So this is the permanent CMBS market. They have all kinds of great data. It's forward-looking. And one of them is they look at the number of CMBS loans that are being put in the hands of special servicers. So this is before there's a default, before they do an auction or liquidation. And it's a bellwether for how much is moving in that direction. And it doubled this year. We're now over 6.5% of all the CMBS loans that have moved into those hands. And the all-time high during COVID was all-time high was 10.3% in June of 2020 during the COVID. And before that, it was 10.3%. So we're approaching 70% of the all-time high number, and we're really only a year into this problem. And it's not all office buildings. I put the chart down there. Look at the assets that have the most that are delinquent and moving to special servicers. Number one is lodging. So that kind of goes contrary to what we've been told about how well hotels are doing. It's mainly because the big convention hotels, the $100 and $200 million deals that were in New York and San Francisco or Atlanta or Dallas, where we aren't going back to those kind of conferences. We're doing smaller conferences in destination markets. Those are the ones that are driving this lodging number up. And then look at retail. We still have a long way to go on the retail side. We've been dealing with it for 10 years and closing stores. 2019, we closed a record, 9,000 big box stores. We still have a trickle, but look at what we're seeing. Look at the Bed Bath & Beyond example. So for the Bed Bath & Beyond bankruptcy, there were five backup offers for every Bed Bath & Beyond store that came to market. And so that's telling us that we haven't built a lot of this stuff. Some of it's in great locations. It can be used for multiple purposes, but they're still in great locations. They're not 80 to 100,000 square feet. They're 20 to 40,000 square feet. So if we dissect and take apart some of the retail and the big box stuff, we see that it maybe isn't such a horrible story. So I look at the TREP data. When things do go wrong, like the office building deals, and you guys have had your share, you just need to either find more Pacific Gas and Electric to pay $1,000 a square foot for their headquarters. If they would just go out and buy more of these buildings, all our office problems would be done, right? But when you have Wells Fargo selling them for 120 to 130, when you have Brookfield walking away from deals, Prudential, Mortgage Group, et cetera, when we have one go bad, the loss, what they call the loss severity. So when there's finally a loss given a default, what kind of money is lost. And the number is essentially in that 40 to 60% range. And so this is what we're worried about in the banks and the entities that are holding these loans. If people default in mass and whatnot, we're really going to take a big haircut. And do they have the capital to withstand that? And so many CCIMs and professionals like out of your organization are going to be called upon from private equity, like a Blackstone or a BlackRock, to say, look, I've got a grab bag of 200 loans, and I need to sort them out and figure out what I should bid. How do I analyze them? Those are where your skills come in. The other area was an opportunity that we're going to see for entities like in your organization or CCIMs is what banks are doing today to stay liquid. Is they're bundling a lot of loans, construction loans, multifamily loans, and they're taking them to the Federal Home Loan Bank or the Fed discount window. And they're saying, here's $100 million of loans, give me $100 million to stay liquid. And they do. That's part of the agreement. But they say, come back in 1 year and take all these loans back and pay me 8% interest on that $100 million. So it's 9 months to a year from now that we're going to see the unintended consequences of banks taking all these loans and getting $100 million from their creditor, the Federal Home Loan Bank or the Fed discount window, and then having to take them back and figure out do they have the capital to do it. And if interest rates are this high and credit's locked up, that's where the opportunity is. Because the Federal Home Loan Bank and the Fed discount window are going to look for entities like our organization to come in and help them sort out those loans and figure out what they really should be repriced at and what they can be sold for in the market. So if you don't know who the Federal Home Loan Bank Board is, if you don't know where yours is in your state, go spend some time with the San Francisco Fed, have them get you introduced out there, and spend some time getting acquainted, because this could be a real big opportunity that we're not thinking about today. All right, so let's wrap up on what's working, kind of some good news stuff here. So here's a big deal we read about over the summer, which was the big industrial deal between Prologis and Blackstone. And so it sold at a 4% cap rate. So everybody out there that's doing industrial called me and said, Casey, the cap rates are still at 4% for industrial. Did you not see this deal? I said, did you not dissect it? So what's going on is Blackstone is faced with massive redemption requests. They need to sell assets. And the only thing that sells is the really good stuff. So they need to raise capital. They need to sell good stuff to meet their redemptions. So who out there is sitting on a lot of cash? Well, Prologis is. Prologis has so much cash flow coming in from all their industrial assets all over the world. They don't want to buy bonds in a rising interest environment. They don't want to buy stock. They don't want to buy their own stock back. They would just like to buy more industrial real estate. So they said, if you give us your best stuff, we'll give you best pricing before the rate hikes. So you have an entity with a lot of cash that wants a lot of really good industrial. You have an entity that needs cash with a lot of good industrial. And they put a deal together, and the price for all industrial is not a 4% cap and $220 a square foot. This was an anomaly in the market. Don't misinterpret that transaction. But here is what is trading and transacting. So what we're finding is even tenants are saying, no longer do we want 500,000 and 1 million square foot e-commerce buildings. We're going to be a little risk averse. We want to do 100,000 to 300,000 square feet, keep building out our supply chain, but we want it in smaller bite-sized nuggets. But we want it in a building that can be expanded, or we want it in a park, an industrial park, where we can get another site and we can do another 300,000 square feet and it work and have synergies. So smaller, honey, I shrunk the big box. Everybody, the tenants on down, every merchant developer that I deal with, and I work with, our company works with some of the biggest, we strategically advise them. I don't think we've seen an over 300,000 square foot deal done this year, whether it's a new leasing or whatnot. This is a great example with the Port of Savannah, 127,000 square feet, done very nicely, all leased up. So here's the other one, port markets. Ports and being along the supply chain are incredibly important. So this example is, I do a lot here in the Southeast and in the Gulf Coast with our ports. And one of the things I do each evening, I do two things each evening. Do I know how I reset my brain? So between 10 and 11 o'clock, I do two things. So the first thing I do is between 10 and 10:30, I turn on TV Land and I watch an episode of Andy Griffin or Leave It to Beaver to realize there really was a good time in America and that maybe we could get back there. What did Andy do right? What did Ward and June Cleaver do right? So it helps me just reset my mind from all the bad news and the murders and, all the bad stuff. The second thing I do is I catch up on my reading for Connect CRE. So all that Connect CRE does is it reports on deals getting done. whether it's a debt deal, a transaction deal. And you'd be shocked if you haven't read this, how many deals are getting done. And they put in there really important things like who are the players. So in this one, I'm highlighting in the Port of Savannah, MetLife. MetLife had been out of the market for almost the first half of this year because they were so rattled by the Fed and rate hikes and Silicon Valley Bank failure that they said, we're not going to do like what we do every year, which is deploy all of our capital that we raised last year selling life insurance policies and annuities. We're going to sit tight on it, and we're not going to deploy it all and then go play golf in the second half of the year. We're going to tell everybody, go play now and come back in the summer, and we'll figure out how we deploy capital. They are now back in the business of deploying capital. Pension funds, life companies are capital that are coming back into the market. So this was a really important revelation. I hadn't seen a MetLife deal mentioned, or I spoke yesterday at a cold storage conference, the first ever for NAIOP. And the same thing, they had the head guy for Prudential. And he said, we're back, excuse me, we're back in the market. We're going to deploy capital. We think we know where our risk tolerances are. The second thing, they're looking at things like if they can pick up the bonus of being in an opportunity zone, but it's smaller stuff. It's leased. They don't want to do spec. So you got to get this thing leased up. So your leasing brokers and whatnot are really, really important right now. And then they looked into the market there, and they've got other buildings that are going through lease up. So there's more expandability. So this was very revealing to me. So I encourage you, if you don't know Connect CRE, it's the only resource I know out there on a national level that just tells you what's getting done, what works, how's it getting done, and who the players are. So I encourage you to read that. The other one that's working, here's your Port of Los Angeles. So I grabbed just 3 recent news stories on what's going on. So in June, you had your strongest cargo volume since a year ago, and the year ago numbers were an all-time record. So things are working, even though we're seeing more rapid port growth on the east of the Gulf Coast ports. It's not net taking away from LA. LA and Long Beach will stay very vital ports servicing over 40 million people and very important to the rest of the world in the Asia trade. So it's not going away. It's just not going to be the throughput to the rest of the country. And that may be a good thing. Maybe you don't build as many warehouses in the Inland Empire and everybody doesn't sue to quit building warehouses in Southern California. They're also doing a lot of things with different agreements for data systems. So on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, we've had our ports collaborate a lot more, from New York down to Charleston and the Florida ports, on data and enabling goods and containers to clear the port more quickly. And so Port of LA just caught up, and they signed a big agreement on data system supports for the entire state of California. The other thing they're doing is they're doing work with entities internationally, like Singapore. And so they just signed an agreement on a green digital shipping corridor that will reduce the carbon emissions, will make them more green, make it more encouraging for entities like Walmart or Nike to use them as a port of preference than maybe something on the East Coast. So a lot of good things are going on in your port. I sometimes forget it because I'm doing so much on the East and the Gulf Coast ports, but your port is an incredible asset. And a lot of what's happening on the shipping on the West Coast is it's consolidating from Seattle and Tacoma and Oakland and Portland down to Southern California. The asset is so good there in LA and Long Beach that you're going to see them gain market share from further up the West Coast. And then when you get up in Seattle and Tacoma and Portland, more of that is going into the Canadian ports like Rupert and down into Vancouver, because they don't have to pay a harbor maintenance tax on those containers. So a lot of reasons, but your port is just as vital and important to you. So I'm going to give you an example of what's not working. It's actually an industrial REIT, but it is a bellwether for everything we face in corporate America going forward. ILPT is an industrial REIT that bought our REIT a year ago, February, called Monmouth. We were the largest landlord for FedEx. We got involved in a hostile takeover action because they wanted our assets, and we ended up having to surrender. Well, ILPT beat out Sam Zell in bidding for our REIT and all of our FedEx and Amazon and Home Depot warehouses. And so they did this deal in February of a year ago. And they said, we're sitting on all this cash. Why should we do a stock deal? Let's spend all our cash. What could go wrong? The Fed hadn't raised rates, right? So they used up all their cash and they bought our REIT. Then they woke up in March and said, where's our cash to pay our dividend? Uh-oh, we can't pay our dividend. So they cut their dividend and their stock dropped by over 50%. And they went from like $1 dividend to 1 penny. So then they said, oh my gosh, and now the Fed's starting to raise interest rates a little bit, but it wasn't too bad in March, just a quarter point. So they didn't do anything in April. So they said, let's go out and take on some debt. Let's replenish our cash with debt. And they bet the wrong way. They took on a big variable rate loan, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars to refill their coffers. And then what happened? We had 9 more interest rate hikes. And now the cost to service that debt is greater than all the operational improvements in the company. So they're at 99% occupancy. They're getting 20% increases in rents, and they can't service the debt. So they've missed earnings and they missed revenue. How many companies have we not discovered yet that have debt structures that mature in a year from now or 2 years from now? And if we're still at these high rate interest environments and they have to go from a 4 or a 5% number to a 7, 8, or 9% number, what does that do to their operational efficiency? That's what worries me. That's what puts me in the camp. We don't know what we don't know yet. So do we redo debt covenants? In this ILPT deal, they thought, well, we'll just sell our assets. We'll sell it down and we'll get right-sized. Well, guess what the debt covenants prohibit? Shrinking. They can't sell the assets. So do we have to go in and restructure the debt covenants? And again, this is where CCIM's financial skills will come into play. But I read about 400 of the 500 S&P 500 earnings. I always find one or two that are very insightful going forward. This was the most insightful earnings release that I read in the second quarter that really gave me pause to think, how do I extrapolate this going forward? And we don't know this true picture unless you go through and extract all the debt structures in all 400 or 500 companies in the S&P 500. You really don't know the answer to this. And then think about small businesses that have the same situation and households. So let's pivot to multifamily. Some of you do multifamily. So what's working in multifamily? It's the Midwest. So 12 of the top 15 MSAs for year-over-year rent growth are all in the Midwest. This has never happened. Hadn't happened in my entire career. Housing, whether it's single family or multifamily, is even beating out all the metrics for the South, which has been the top for starts and price increases and everything else. And what it really tells us is this is that race towards affordability. Where can I go? And the millennial generation is saying, you know what? If I can be in a great place that has a good airport, that I can go every month and take a vacation somewhere, I'm going to go to where there's affordability. If I only need to make $50,000 a year to have a living wage, but I want to do services and travel and have fun, I don't care about owning a home. This is the demographic that's coming up. It's going to be very different than your or my demographic. I'm 61. I bought my first house at 22. And so they're not following that. I have $2 million. So if you want to look for an opportunity, work with a fellow, CCIM and Daryl Quotes in Wichita, Kansas, or any of your fellow CCIMs, hook up with them in Seattle. Partner on some deals in the Midwest. This could be a really good play for you. What's working in retail? Anything with a grocery store, they're all working. I don't know a life company that won't do a grocery store deal if you're number 1, 2, or 3 in your market in terms of market share. Even if you're a shadow across from a very successful top grocer, if you look at the top 100 retailers, the majority of them are all retail grocery type stores. So grocery is a recipe that's working in retail, and even there in your markets that are somewhat challenged. Another one, I always try to find a retailer, a really successful retail story. In the latest earnings, I picked up on Tractor Supply. So they're a very successful company. They're kind of like a Bed Bath & Beyond. They only need about 20,000 square feet. They have over 2,300 stores. They want to add 200 more stores a year going forward. They're well capitalized, low leverage. They're adding things like pet services and garden centers. I'm sure you have them throughout the West there. These make great in kind of the secondary markets. So this is a great retailer. If you're looking to put somebody in something that's about 20,000 square feet or dividing a 40 or 50,000 square foot box, and you don't have a Tractor Supply, this might be an entity that you go approach because they're growing, they're fiscally good. It's a really good retail story. What's not working in retail? You know this one, Mark. It's like, why can't I find a Walgreens is open in San Francisco anymore, right? It's because of the shoplifting. We can't say that anymore. It's politically incorrect. They call it shrink or something. when I think of shrink, I think of that wrap that you put around things to package things. I don't think about it as, shoplifting. But here's the reason we need to think about what's happening there. The last thing that gets compensated in a real estate deal is the real estate. We were taught to do highest and best use in land residual, and the last thing that gets compensated is the building and the land. The more money that retailers are having to spend on technology and securing their retail is going to come out of our real estate grant, or we're going to have to provide that in a tenant improvement. So this is why we need to care about it. This is why we need to engage in this topic with the National Retail Federation. If we don't help our retailers figure out how to combat this problem, where as long as you don't steal more than $500, it's okay. It's not a crime. They don't call the cops. We've got to stop that behavior. And we've got to work all areas of our industry and our tenants to stop that. So that's not what's working. So here's my bottom line. This is a piece I just did for the Capital Markets Update for Urban Land Institute. So I got the opening paragraph and the closing paragraph. So any story, that's where you want to be, because nobody reads the rest of the story, right? And so in there, the bottom line that I put in there, the left arrow on the left there, the problem we face today is not that we over-leveraged real estate, not that we overbuilt it, not that we initially overvalued it. It's all about capital. The problem is capital. And because commercial real estate is so capital intensive, if you turn the spigot off, it doesn't take very long to have a really bad multi-car collision on the interstate. And that's what we have. So we have to figure out, how do we solve the capital problem? And I wouldn't look to the Fed to provide solutions anytime soon. We're going to have to look at different capital sources, family and friends, credit unions, international money, more equity in deals. That's our number one headwind. And if there's any group, our CCIMs in your organization that know how to think through capital issues, that's what we face today. And if we can solve capital, we broke nothing else. It's kind of like your dad's car, where all you did was scrape the bumper, but you didn't, crush the whole fender and the door and everything else. We don't have to go to the body shop. We can, with the old chrome bumpers, we can get some shining compound and we can buff it out, and you'll never know that you scraped the chrome bumper. So we can get capital working again. It'll be just like a scraped chrome bumper and not a whole damaged car. So I told you at the end, if you stick around, I tell you the solution is stick them. So I grew up in Colorado. I go back a lot. Took my special needs son, Luke, here out for 3 weeks this summer. We did a really neat camp, a young life camp in the mountains. And one of the fun activities was midweek. We did a trail ride at sunrise out to a Wrangler breakfast. And so we rode the horses out, nice 50-degree weather. It couldn't be any better. But, I just want to be there the rest of my life. And so you can see in the lower middle left section there's actually a chuck wagon, and they make breakfast, and you got to catch your breakfast. They throw the French toast out of the chuck wagon, and you got to catch it on your plate. Well, of course, nobody can catch the French toast on their plate. It slides right off. So after about 24 pieces hit the ground and the bears started to wake up and were starting to come into camp, we figured we better figure out how to teach people how to catch their breakfast. So the answer was stick them. We put a little syrup on the plate. So when the French toast flies through the air and it hits the plate, it sticks. And that's what I would really say is we've got to figure out, we've got to find the stick them. How to get deals to stick, how to get them to close, how to get them through the market process. And so my recommendation for a great Christmas gift for all of your hardworking people and your clients is a bottle of syrup, whether it's Mrs. Butterworth or Aunt Jemima or something from New England. But the stickum that you have in your organization, in your leadership, it's your education, it's your experience, it's having been through prior crises to think them through. Go back to that article I said, CRE dead or long live CRE. What did we not see in each of those crises that then developed to solve the crisis problem that we're not seeing today? So we have no cash for nobody, NCNB. We have higher interest rates, I think, for a long time. I don't think the Fed cuts rates. The earliest is 2025. And then, we got to look at things like manufactured housing or other options for solving our affordable housing problem. So you guys and CCIMs have Stickum. Go put your Stickum to work. So with that, Mark, we can open up to any questions.
Casey, wow, just absolutely incredible amount of information, visuals. It takes a lot of going back through this for each and every one of us to absorb the highlights that you provided today. So thank you so very much. We do really appreciate this. I'm pleased that we have Sperry University in its formation here, and this is the second webinar that we've had. So thank you to Red Shoe Economics, yourself, and Beverly for providing this economic update for us on the state of the economy and the commercial real estate markets. And I think a lot of people, they certainly want to put their head in the sand and kind of ignore what's going on around. But I do believe there's kind of a dichotomy there, and you've shown that there's the what we kind of think we see out there, but you show us the real underlying metrics that are affecting the markets. And it seems to me like, yeah, we need to be prepared. Sperry University is a great way to be prepared. It provides the education and the insights. And to each and every one of you on this call, highly recommend you find the time to listen to KC's, Conway's presentation at least twice a year. It gives you the insights that you need to be able to sit down with your clients to share some of these insights with them, because they're not getting access to this. So thank you, Casey. We have a couple of questions. I'm cognizant of the time. We're about 10 minutes over what we allocated, but it's such a huge topic. So a couple of questions that came in, and you did answer these, but where do you see mortgage rates going in 2024? You showed us the, you basically just said that, you expect them not to see a rate cut until 2025. Where do you think they're going to get to?
So I think the Fed's got, probably 50 to 75 basis points more in increases by the end of the year. So that means 2 of their remaining 3 meetings, they're going to have to do a 25 or a 50 or a couple of 25s. So that gets them to a 6% overnight borrowing rate. So you add 2% to that and you're at an 8% mortgage rate. So the existing inventory, we've seen it dry up. If you have your house paid off or you have a 3%, 4% mortgage, why would you sell and go buy back in the market and have to buy something more expensive at 7 or 8%? You won't. So there's no existing inventory developing. So it's new homes that are selling. And we're seeing good numbers there, 700,000 new home sales. Why is it working for them even though construction costs are higher? And the answer is that builders are buying down the rate. So they can do up to 6% of the value of the home in rate buy downs. And so they can get you back below. So right now they can get you probably into a high 5s rate with a rate buy down. And so if the Fed does a couple more and they get us, to an 8% rate, the builders then can only probably get this thing a little bit below 7. So I think we're going to a 6% overnight borrowing rate. I think mortgage rates hit or go above 8%. I think we may even see the end of the inverted yield curve. So what an inverted yield curve means is when it's higher rates at the short end, it means the market's really scared of the current period of next year. But they think things are going to work out fine long term. And they don't worry about getting paid for long-term risk. What's happening is the market is starting to say, we're worried this is going to last long. What's the phrase that the Fed and every one of them go out and speak that's higher for longer and all that kind of stuff. So they're embedding the psychology of longer. And so the market is starting to say, I want to be paid for that duration. And I want to be paid for that duration risk. And I think we could see a flat yield curve by the first quarter of next year.
Okay, all right. Thank you for answering that. So building handcuffs on existing inventory, but new inventory, that's where you could see some opportunity. Yep. Okay. Next question is from, okay, let me go to some of the questions that came in. Nick was asking, I believe you said that banks will be facing heavy commercial real estate defaults in about 9 months to 1 year's time. How low would the Fed need to drop rates to significantly mitigate the risk of default?
So it'd have to almost be 200 basis points right now. So you got to get it back where the banks can make more on lending out than they're paying you. So if they're having to pay you 5.5%, 6%, 7%, and they can only lend out, at 5 or less than 6, the Fed's got to move those rates down about 200 basis points. So they'd have to get us back down from, if they go to a 6% overnight lending rate, they got to get us back into the 4s.
Get it back into the 4s, yeah. And then one more question here. What are the key indicators pointing to a near-term recession? Yeah, you showed us the W pattern from prior recessions, and we're kind of artificially, I guess, kind of like back up on the inside of that W. Are we going to see a recession? Is this a real situation we're in now, or is it just government intervention that's kind of making things feel like they're okay, but we're going to see a recession?
I think, especially with an election year coming in, we're going to see the government work to make it where we don't meet the National Bureau of Economic Research technical definition, 2 consecutive quarters, and it'll take them 2 years to figure that out anyway. I think we can have a recession without having 5 or 6% unemployment and without GDP going negative. And so that's going to make people's heads scratch. So I'm looking at things like National Federation of Independent Businesses, business failures. We've seen more small business failures and bankruptcies this year than we did in 2009. I look at things like the consumer confidence. I want to see if that W, the second part of that W, develops later this year. I really want to pay attention to earnings. Bellwether companies that are in my MSA or my state. So you guys are heavy on the tech side. How does tech hold up? Because a lot of tech is valued based on future earnings, and if it gets discounted at a higher rate, the tech stock is worth a lot less. So do we see earnings multiple compression? So, do we go below 20? And remember that a cap rate is just the inverse of a stock multiple. So if you want to know what cap rates are doing, if you see those multiples compress, that means the cap rate's going up. So I'm really watching those earnings multiples and paying attention. And I'm looking for those nuggets like an ILPT that says, we're 99% leased, we're getting 20% increases in revenue, and we can't make revenues or earnings per share because the cost to service the debt is too great. How many more of those do we have? And then finally on the banks, I'm following closely, the Texas ratio. Which banks are getting to a point where they're near a 10%? So banks are, 10% capital, they're highly leveraged. And so if they get to a point where they're at a 10% Texas ratio, which simply means the number of at-risk assets that need to be revalued and their whatnot are about 10% their capital, they're insolvent, they're walking dead. We have about 700 of those right now out of our 4,100 banks. And the Fed's done nothing. What they've done is that they're kind of looking at doing more of the PacWest model. Take a bank that's in trouble, find a smaller bank, shrink both and put them together. So in that PacWest deal, they made them shrink quite a bit. And they made them pay off all of those loans that they took from the Federal Home Loan Bank. It's almost $150 million of loans that were put at the discount window of the Federal Home Loan Bank. They all had to be paid off as part of the transaction being done. So I'm really going to watch if we may see the FDIC do fewer bank closings and failures and do more forced mergers. I just did a presentation and an exercise where they were graphing CRE concentrated banks against their net interest margin, where you had a high CRE concentration, over 300% of your capital, and you had net interest margins that were negative. They identified those banks across the country, and they said, those are the ones we're going to go to work on forcing mergers. It's hundreds and hundreds of banks. So I want to really pay attention to the capital and the banking side. And then, the other one, I want to see what are the capital sources that are coming to the market. So I read, really closely all the Connect CRE stuff. Who's in, who's not in, who hasn't been there the last 6 months. Hey, I finally see MetLife. I finally see Prudential, coming back in. Or I see a family and friends fund come in. I just was a group, and I couldn't believe the amount of family and funds money that's ready to come in and go to work on this stuff. So,
a lot of capital out there.
Yeah, and you just got to translate all this stuff local. Like I said, on the GDP, translate it down to by state. Translate all of these metrics on jobs and GDP and its economic, translate them local, because just trying to run a business and make real estate decisions based on national numbers is insane. You want to do it local. We all know real estate's local.
Right, absolutely. Okay, well, this has been absolutely fantastic. A lot of capital out there, a lot of opportunity out there. I think a great opportunity for each and every one of us as agents to work with our clients, educate them on what's really happening in the market, what the real drivers are. And Casey and Beverly, Casey's business partner of Red Shoe Economics, they are available for consultation, of course. They run their own economic business, so you can reach out directly to Casey. If you want consultation, you can figure that out directly with Casey. He's there to help you, particularly with questions like Cheryl Powell of our Denver office came through on a development project that she's working on. It's got a couple of years delivery, a little concerned about how's the market going to look over the next couple of years when that project comes online. That'll be a perfect conversation, perhaps, to pick up directly with Casey. But in the interest of time, this has been packed full of incredible information. Thank you to everyone from around the country for joining in today and staying with this over the duration. It's been a long webinar, and I'm sure we'll spend a lot more time going through the slides. It has been recorded. We do have the slides. We will be sharing this. As a wrap, Casey, thank you so very much. We greatly appreciate this, and I look forward to